Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. No sponsors today. Jurassic Park reached out, but, I don't really agree with what they've been doing. If the dinosaurs had won, would they be making movies about getting trapped on an island full of us? I don't think so, So get it together, Jurassic Park. Get it together. Speaking of getting it together, Arina Sabalenka is through in a terrifying fashion into the semifinals here. She plays Amanda Anisimova. This is definitely, the best semifinal I think we were going to get in this side of the draw. Anisimova is actually 5-3 in this matchup, which is pretty good news if you want a competitive semifinal. One of the few players with a positive head-to-head against Sabalenka at this point. They've never met on grass, but I wouldn't discount the head-to-head because Anisimova has won a bunch of their meetings on hard court. I think coming into this match, both are happy to have squeaked by, but it's a bit of a tale of two cities as far as, the form that they bring. Sabalenka was really rough at times against Siegemund. She landed 65% first serves for the match, which is good, but just really made a ton of errors and in spots that she didn't want to. It's fine to make errors when you're coasting or when you're working yourself into form, but, big moments, it just felt like she wasn't really that reliable. Siegemund hits a lot of slices, drop shots, just genuinely has a difficult game to deal with on grass. But neither player had a positive ratio of winners to unforced errors. So, with Sabalenka's serve ratio, you'd think she could get through there in, a bit quicker fashion. 14 breaks of serve in the match. So just really not bad, ridiculously exciting, but it felt like Sabalenka just barely hung on rather than won the match, Sabalenka has shown in the past few months that she has some focus, effort issues. This was common in the past, but she'd ironed it out a bit since becoming world number one. When it's early in the set, or it's not really at the finish line, she's not in scoreboard pressure. She smashes away at the ball and gestures unhappily at the ones that miss. When it actually becomes apparent she's going to lose a set or the match, she locks in and keeps the ball on the court. Magically, that tends to work at that point. When on-court coaching visits were a thing in the WTA, pretty standard advice they'd give the player would be to just drive the ball hard down the center of the court for a few games. Remarkably, they'd almost always, get the break back that they had lost, which would trigger a coaching visit from the opposing player. On grass, that is a good tactic just to drive the ball. Sabalenka hits the ball heavier and faster than everyone on tour. Tennis is tricky, but it's simple. If she puts in the work, she wins because even at neutral from the baseline, her serve is still going to get her across the finish line. So, these are mental lapses, I think. I don't want to take credit away from Siegemund, who played great. She had a great week. But I feel like Sabalenka is just there for the taking at this moment. Late in the match, Sabalenka got really tense. She decelerated massively on her forehand and started hitting the net pretty often. Siegemund had played a lot of slices to hang on in the big points, but I think here if she had just hit the ball with some pace at the end, she would have won. She had control in some rallies, she had some sitters, and, she hit one more slice, just looking for Sabalenka to kind of give her the match more than taking it. It's tough to have that recognition after a few hours to realize that the other player really is folding up, but very rare that the top players give you the win. You kind of have to take it once they finally, wave the white flag. And, for them, decelerating is waving the white flag. They go push mode also. Even the biggest offenses in the world start to just push the ball in when they suddenly realize that things might go bad. You don't want to lose on an error, I guess, mentally in that moment. It almost worked for Siegemund, but, Sabalenka was able to find her backhand for a few errors late in the match. I'll talk more about it later, but Sabalenka really stopped swinging here. She was kind of scared to make errors. Rather than swing her arm, she was trying to guide the ball in, had a lot of body language, kind of like launching herself forward, a bit, just trying to force the ball to go in, but without any real margin. The result was a number of forehands in the net, a deterioration of her technique at a pivotal time, which, it could easily have cost her the match, and I think Anisimova would be happy to play Siegemund. I don't think she'd have a similar struggle. I don't think Sabalenka can afford the same type of errors or struggle against Anisimova, but I don't really guarantee she plays the same way here because it's a much different matchup, as far as the ball she'll be dealing with. Anisimova is going to hit the ball hard with topspin most of the time. She doesn't play a lot of drop wow, I can't say that word today. Drop shots or slices. You know, Sabalenka can sometimes time things really well when she plays against another big hitter. You know, when the two big hitters come up against each other, it tends to be who has the bigger forehand that wins those exchanges, and the other player has to come up with something different. I think the big question here for Anisimova is serving. If she can land first serves, I think she can win this. Her offense has been really unplayable this week. She started off every match at a great level. Not really serving. You know, she was only at 45%, I think, for the first set against Pavlyuchenkova. But I think she wins the first here a good chunk of the time. Her shot selection and her returning have been really aggressive and sharp early in the match. You know, and from there, things get a little tricky. Against Pavlyuchenkova, she basically had so much control that she started having trouble deciding when to pull the trigger. She went for some clean return winners off serves that maybe could have been, you know, two-shot combos, looking to just drive one and then put the point away. It's hard to do that when you know the match is kind of over. It's hard to temper your offense because it's there for the taking, but you making errors is something you haven't been doing. You know, the other person only gets tight and only has trouble when you're playing, you know, optimal error-free tennis. So when you start giving them that, it can kind of give them some hope, you know. And then that reset, you know, if you're going very aggressive, you tend to Pac-Man off the screen sometimes. You get so aggressive that you start to miss. And then when you try to rein it in, what happens is you tend to get a bit passive with your shot selection, which gives the other player time to play. And that's basically what happened here. You know, Pavlyuchenkova had really bad timing issues early in the match, trouble landing returns. Her forehand was pretty wild. But once she settled in the second set, it got tricky. Anisimova was up a break twice, wound up in the tiebreaker, and, you know, there were 11 mini breaks there. Amanda had to play some really clutch points to close it out. It's good that she did, but if Pavs is making those inroads, I worry that Sabalenka can also. You know, Anisimova serves well when it lands, but 45% is not good enough. She got it up above 50 for the second set, but, you know, it's a spot where the first big swing is going to win points. So, you know, Anisimova wants to be more accurate and less powerful maybe on the serving here, especially because Sabalenka is not really timing the ball that great. This is a huge opportunity for her, obviously, against a familiar opponent, so I think it'll be close. Neither player is really equipped to defend against their opponent's offense, but Sabalenka is probably the better athlete. You know, so in a roller coaster match, she might have the benefit of a few extra gets, just a little bit more pressure, and I think she has a little bit more stamina too. It's like a long-winded way of me saying it's a great matchup. But I kind of thought that Anisimova was winning this tournament before the tournament. When the draw came out, it looked good for her. You know, a lot of players that she can score on, not really the tricky matchups that can get her into trouble. You know, the players who are going to make her play, you know, 3 hours of baseline tennis. Sabalenka obviously needs to level up. You know, the level is there, but she hasn't really displayed the type of tennis that's going to beat Anisimova. So I almost think, you know, obviously Sabalenka is always going to be the favorite in the prices, but I think it's closer to even here. You know, I also think Sabalenka doesn't really have the most mental fortitude right now. She really was, you know, folding up against Siegemund. It was clear that she was scared to lose. And, you know, when that's in your head every single time there's, you know, scoreboard pressure, it's difficult. And then you add in that Anisimova, you know, is going to feel pretty comfortable here in this matchup. She's playing really well. Grass keeps the points shorter, which works for her stamina issues. It starts to all add up for Anisimova to play really well. You know, and the crowd will get behind her. So I do think Anisimova wins in 2. I hate to pick 2 things, but I think Sabalenka could win in 3 also. I like Amanda's level heading in, but I think Pavlyuchenkova, you know, the Pavlyuchenkova lapse presents the opportunity for Sabalenka to drag things out. You know, this, oh no, I'm going to lose, oh, I won in 3 thing that Sabalenka does is obviously not by design, but it does show that as the match goes on, she's able to win with her power and her serving. You know, I think when both are fatigued, Sabalenka is going to be the more efficient server just by being taller, you know, having kind of a more margin for error on her serve and more variety too in her serving. Yeah. Swiatek and Bencic, pretty good matchup. A little bit surprising, maybe, but you know, both players really have earned it here. Swiatek's intensity was just overwhelming again today. She rushed Samsonova into errors just constantly the first set. She was up a break twice in the second early on. At that point, she did, back off a bit and make some errors, and then Samsonova was able to find her best tennis, so, it let her break back, put some pressure on, but this is the point where the momentum tends to swing in the WTA. A player's up a set in a break, and when that break gets given back, things can get really, really tight. Credit to Swiatek. She didn't lose face in her technique, though. She didn't decelerate. I talked about Sabalenka being a little hesitant with the ball, and Swiatek wasn't. Even though she made some errors, she just kept swinging, and I think that really helps because, the pedigree is there. These players are great. They shouldn't lose faith in the technique because they are professional players. Maybe fatigue issues can wear down your accuracy, but overall, you want to believe in yourself here because you should. You have the credentials for it. Even with the open court late in the match, Swiatek was still swinging with full commitment. She wasn't trying to play safe. She wasn't hoping the point would end. Just really still trying to hit winners, and that never gave Samsonova any rhythm. And for a player like her to have no rhythm, every error gets in her head. So a really well played match by Swiatek. And again, she's just body serving everyone to death this week, just constantly hitting the ball right at them. I almost like it because Swiatek kind of has a confrontational type of game style anyway. So you might as well just start it off by, challenging the player to hit the ball past you. With Sabalenka looking halfway vulnerable, I feel like Swiatek is starting to look like she has a decent chance at this title. Adding a Wimbledon title would be amazing for her. She does want, she struggles on faster surfaces, but she wants to get better at them. And when a player wants to improve, they can. The same has been said about, people said Goff has forehand and serve issues. Yeah, but she wants to improve that, and she is. And, clearly it's slowly happening. So, you have to believe in players who want to put the work in because everything is really possible for them. They have the resources, they have the skill, they have the physical ability. Up next for Swiatek is Bencic, who has returned from maternity leave and, reestablished herself at the top of the tour. She's always been a great player, and, it's great to see her bounce back in this way. The eye test says no, but, since this is her first Wimbledon semifinal, you could almost argue she's at a higher level than before. Just really managing her game well this week. The manner that she's gotten here, it makes it extremely well-deserved. She's been outlasting everyone so far. And against Andreeva, she didn't just show a ton of resolve. She kind of leveled up, I would say. She had to produce a bit more offense and play much longer points than she had earlier in the match, but she never dropped her level, and I think she didn't alter her shot selection in a lot of the big moments, which was the key for her. I think that was the key in in a match that was decided in 2 tiebreaks. It's hard to say this is exactly what went wrong, but I felt like Bencic played more aggressive, throughout, whereas Andreeva varied her level. Late in the match, Bencic was up 7-6, 5-4, serving for the match. And I thought that's where momentum really shifted in a strange way. Mira Andreeva was able to completely lock in on defense. She got things back on even terms, but I thought the effort and the tactics she used made it a little tougher to win the set. Rather than hitting through the ball, Andreeva went to a slice forehand. She used this a lot in the match, but in that pressure moment, she basically just went full push mode with the slices. She still hit a few two-handed backhands when she had the time, but it was really conservative with all but one of them. The reversion to the slice forehand on a big point is a somewhat common thing in tennis, even at the pro level. But even when it works, it still might not be the best sign. Andreeva stayed a bit cautious with the ball even after that game, and her shot started to lack the depth that had really gotten her to this point in the event. She was really painting the baseline early. She hit the ball deep early also. It's hard for her to hit through Bencic because, Bencic hits the ball a little heavier. But still, that depth was a key. Even if you're not scoring, it still frustrates the opponent. By the time the tiebreaker arrived in the second set, her forehand was landing around the service line pretty regularly. When she had the open court, she was also very tentative, and that kind of made Bencic the more aggressive player there, even though Bencic was just staying in her usual patterns. As much as I felt bad that Andreeva got tight, I have to give the credit to Bencic. She got a bit tight with shot selection when she was dealing with Mira's slices, when she was serving for the second set. But she just hit the ball the entire match. She was really good at dealing with the drop shot. She has a really good backhand cross when the ball's low at net. And, Mira just wasn't able to score on her there. And, as long as she stays solid from the baseline, pretty even match. Mira might serve a little bit more efficiently, but not as big, I think. I think Andreeva had a hard time scoring today, Really never a time when Bencic deviated from plan A. And I know that's her normal game, but to do that in a big moment, it got her the match, because this really could have gone either way, even though Andreeva didn't look at her best today. When the tiebreaker came, Bencic was the one hitting more dangerous shots. Andreeva's defense is obviously remarkable, but Wimbledon's about offense. The bigger hitter, the player landing the ball nearer the baseline is going to be the favorite. They're going to get more bad bounces. They're going to apply more pressure. Andreeva looked pretty sad leaving the court. She was drying some tears, which is hard to watch, but I think she knows she missed a good opportunity there. Obviously, at 18 years old, she's going to get a boatload of opportunities. I almost think it's good for these moments to come early so she can learn from them. I don't think, her and Conchita are going to, they've been game planning well for almost everything. I think today they had, an okay plan, just a tough matchup problem here. And, when you blink in the big moments, it's fine. It happens, and second guessing is easy. I can say, oh, she should have gone more aggressive. But, maybe she goes more aggressive in the 5-4 game and Bencic wins in, 7-6, 6-4. So hard for me to be sure. I think the coaching you want to give, it's a little long to give it mid-match, is just to tell the player to believe in their shots at the end. You can see the player getting tentative and thinking that they're going to force the issue and miss. Sometimes a player's speed, if you're hitting to the open court and the player is quick, you can clench because you know the gap is closing. You can force things that way. But this looked more like she just didn't want to miss. She wanted the points to be over. You need to remind the player that they are good and that the errors are the outlier, not the standard. Players should aim high with their tennis, not just because it's optimal, but because they really are that good. You're a professional. You have the ability to do this. It's what the fans want to see. It's the kind of tennis you want to play. And, if you want to talk about, optimal, that's what is optimal, is for you to aim for that level. And it's also most likely that you play at that level. The outlier matches are really unavoidable. You can't play perfect tennis all the time. A lifetime of tennis training is going to get you to the point where you have those skills and you can convert. And also, when you do convert, the nerves stop arriving in those moments. When you've played that big tiebreaker, next time Andreeva's on the court in a big match, she's going to go for her shots. She's going to win. And, this issue is going to, disappear for a time. As with most anxiety, it's really just a matter of a good what if thought catching your attention momentarily. And in sport, the time to make a decision is so brief that it's really easy to tense up or go safe when that pops up. You have the forehand down the line, and I really hope I don't miss it comes up, which is the most useless thought to come up in that moment. But all of a sudden, you go safe, or you change your shot, or you miss it, or you guide the ball in. As far as the thought coming up, I would offer a little advice. Like, mine tends to be reflexive in a sense. So when you do go for it in those moments, when you don't give the attention to that phantom worry, it tends not to come as often. If we're thinking about, let's say you have a project at work that you've been working on, there's a deadline coming up, it's going to frequently come to your mind because it's something you've been working on. And when it comes up, you're going to give it a little thought, do a little more work, and then let it go. It's going to come up again because it's useful. At the same rate, if something that's nonsense comes up, like buy a big boat, you're going to be like, I can't buy a big boat, leave me alone. And it's not really going to come up again. Our brains are useful tools. We have to kind of guide the ship a little bit. There's a good Tao Te Ching line that says something like, hope and fear are both phantoms that come from thinking of the self. I don't want to dig too deep into it here, but I will offer a little tip just to use in those spots on the court. Obviously, Mira's not listening to this, but, it can help in club matches or even just to enjoy playing more. Focusing on breathing is usually the best tactic when experiencing anxiety in any case, and it actually is here also. When we encounter something scary, even if it's a thought, we tend to tense up. Whether we realize it or not, in those moments, we generally hold our breath. This dips our heart rate pretty quickly, which honestly, even in a second can slightly affect athletic performance, and if you're doing that frequently on those points, it can mess with you a bit. In real life, when we're anxious, our body also releases adrenaline, and the combination of heart rate dipping from the breath holding and quickening from the adrenaline can make us feel pretty off center for a while. At the beginning of a match, sometimes you'll feel pretty nervous. It's good, to show up early. Obviously, the pros are doing this, but, just for club players, it's good to show up a bit early for a match if you don't have a lot of experience. Just hit the ball a little more than usual. You're not going to get fatigued. It's just good to get past that initial, adrenaline dump. You'll see parkour athletes do this too. If they have a big jump, they'll train for the jump, they'll get ready, and then rather than going for it once they're ready, they'll kind of take some practice runs and wait for that adrenaline dump to show up. And then they'll go train a little more and come back when they're settled. It's good to understand how your body works. It helps you compete at your best. As far as why it happens, it's kind of like a holdover from the old fight or flight response. If you were in the forest at night back in the day, and you heard a branch snap, you'd freeze. You'd hold your breath, make no sound, get ready to run or fight, the hippopotamus or grizzly bear or whatever was out there. With that, the adrenaline helped. Helps get your body ready for quick bursts of athletic activity. But, it's important to note that even in those situations, the hippo doesn't exist yet, which I guess is my point here. We hear the sound and we turn our attention to the what if thought. It's obviously, during a split second event on the tennis court, but the tense holding of breath, can occur in those moments. And it does lead to tension and skipping a breath, which isn't the best for athletic performance. It's not, if you're holding your breath and trying to hit the ball, not as good as if you take a deep breath and then hit it. Obviously, most of the time we're inhaling before we hit a ball. Pro players are timing this right. They're practicing that. But, in those moments of tension, when we have a big shot, it can really help to consciously get in the practice of taking a deep inhale. Just for reference, we focus on taking a big backswing, on a big point. Like, let me focus on my technique. Let me think through the preparation and my footwork. It doesn't hurt to add a minor step and just focus on taking a deep breath. Breathing returns us to the present moment and turns our attention away from the thought and back to where it needs to be, which is on the court. Anyway, that's a long way of saying that breathing is good. I encourage you to breathe. Take one, maybe take two. Take a bunch. Get into it. Anyway, back to the tennis. I like Swiatek's side here. She's hitting really well to the open court. She's taking the ball early. I know that's Bencic's thing, but Swiatek is really exposing the movement of her opponents. And the big wrinkle that makes this dangerous is that Bencic seemed to have an issue in her legs late in the match. She was limping late in the second set. I couldn't really tell if it was a cramp, fatigue, or an injury, but I'm not exactly sure that that matters here. I think it's a problem either way. If it was cramping or fatigue, Swiatek is going to be at least as exhausting as Andreeva. If it was a slight injury, I think that's going to be an issue also. Swiatek has made basically every opponent run sprint drills, and Bencic has played huge offenses and solid baseliners. Iga sort of merges the two. At the same time, there's good doctors at work here. Bencic was able to finish the match playing fine, so I think this will be close if she's healthy. Their last meeting actually was at Wimbledon in 2023. They split 2 tiebreakers to start the match, and then Bencic lost a 6-3 final set. I think physically at this point, Bencic has expended a lot of energy, which is why I'm kind of focusing on that. She's been on court 10 hours and 9 minutes. For Swiatek, 7 hours and 52 minutes. That's basically like playing an entire extra quarterfinal. And Bencic here is the one with a possible stamina issue as far as mobility. So I think it'll be close in the early going, but this will look like one of those Swiatek-Nadal style matches. Bencic is wildly skillful and doesn't really have a hole in her game. I just think, Swiatek, can kind of drag her. Swiatek's, main method of winning has been to drag people deep and then pull away as the match goes on. So I think, 2 or 3, I think Swiatek can get through. Not one, Bencic is a great player, but the one bright point I think is that because she likes to hug the baseline and take the ball early, she'll be able to rush Swiatek a bit, and that is the one thing that does make Iga miss. So I don't think this is going to be a blowout in any case. I just think that Swiatek has a bit more left in the tank here. So really good semifinals here. Gonna wait. I don't know if I said this earlier. I'm gonna wait on the men's. I'm gonna wait a couple hours to see if there's any more news as far as the injury concerns. Djokovic took a big fall at the end of the match, possible groin issue. He said he's fine. We'll see what media says. Sinner's arm was taped up underneath the sleeve today, so we'll see, what he says. Just kind of want to see if any extra info pops up. I doubt that it will. They're pretty cagey about what they release, but the men's side will probably go up tonight around like 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'll see you then.